All right, class. So moving on to the second part of our carbohydrates lecture here, we're talking about the uses and roles for carbohydrates in our body, how our body regulates the amount of available glucose or carbohydrate that's traveling through our circulatory system. And then we'll talk a bit about glycemic index and glycemic load, which are both values that we use to indicate the impact of available carbohydrate in our body from different foods. So all of the monosaccharides or all of the carbohydrates are going to be digested and broken down into monosaccharides and then absorbed into our intestinal cells and towards our liver. And in the liver, all of those monosaccharides will be converted to glucose. And so hopefully you remember from the last portion of this lecture that there are 3 different monosaccharides that we regularly get in our diet, glucose obviously being one of them. We also get fructose from a lot of our fruits and vegetables, all of our plant sources. Fructose is the monosaccharide that makes things taste sweet. And then we have galactose, which is a mammalian monosaccharide, which when combined with glucose makes lactose. So glucose is going to be the main energy source that our body uses during activity. So to power a majority of the work that our body is doing, especially in like our brain cells, our neurons, and our red blood cells. Any excess glucose, so any glucose that is not being immediately taken up by another cell and used as a source of energy, is going to be converted into glycogen, the storage form, which is a polysaccharide. So many, many glucose molecules combined together creates glycogen. And so those glucose will be stored in the liver. And a small amount of glycogen can also be stored in our skeletal muscles. So throwing back to when we talked about the different metabolic pathways in our body, right? We have our pathways that build large molecules and our pathways that break large molecules into their smaller pieces. So these are either anabolic or catabolic. So you can take a minute to think about this question. But catabolism, or the catabolic pathway, is breaking down large molecules into smaller pieces. So digestion is a catabolic process. Converting those small pieces parts into larger molecules, such as converting glucose into glycogen, is an anabolic process. It builds a large molecule from smaller molecules. Any extreme excess of glucose, rather than being stored as glycogen, is going to be converted into fatty acids, which can then be stored in our adipose tissue. Okay? So a majority of our glucose that we get from our food is going to be absorbed by the cells throughout our body to be used to do work. Any excess will be stored as glycogen. Any extreme excess, so we have more glucose than we need to build up our storage of glucose, that will then be converted into fatty acids and stored as fat in our adipose tissue. Okay. So we get our carbohydrates from what we're eating. Those carbohydrates will be digested in the mouth and in the small intestine. They will then be absorbed through the small intestine into our capillaries. The capillaries will take them to the liver, where most of that glucose will likely be sent back into the circulatory system so that it is available for the cells that need it. And then any excess will be stored as glycogen, either in the liver or in some of our skeletal muscles. So there is one category of carbohydrates that we will not ever be able to make use of. Right? As humans, we do not create the enzyme necessary in order to digest fiber. Fiber is a super dense polysaccharide. However, the bacteria that live within our large intestine do create the enzyme to digest fiber. So a small portion of the fiber that we are getting from our diet will actually end up being digested, just not by us, not by our enzymes. It will be digested by the bacteria in our large intestine. And as a result of that digestion, the bacteria will release some small fatty acids and gas as a result. And so we can then absorb those short fatty acids and then use them as an energy source or a building block. However, most of the fiber that we're consuming is essentially just going to be taking up space throughout our digestive process and will eventually be eliminated as feces. Okay. So tracking digestion here. Digestion of carbohydrates starts in the mouth. You remember we have salivary amylase, so some of that enzyme within our saliva that allows for chemical digestion of carbohydrates. And then, of course, chewing is going to mechanically digest any of our food products, any of our macronutrients. So as that food makes it into the stomach, the hydrochloric acid in our stomach will deactivate any amylase that came from our saliva. So all digestion of carbohydrates stops in the stomach. And then once once the chyme of all those different nutrients mixed with the hydrochloric acid in the stomach ends up making it into the small intestine, then chemical digestion of those carbohydrates will pick back up again. So the pancreas will secrete even more amylase into the small intestine, and that amylase will continue chemically digesting carbohydrates until all of it is broken down and absorbed. So by the end of the small intestine, the only carbohydrates that should be left would be fiber. And then that fiber will make it to the large intestine, and a small amount of that fiber will be chemically digested by the bacteria, which release fatty acids as a byproduct. So just explain this, but take a second to think, where does digestion of carbohydrates not occur? Hopefully you were able to pick the stomach here. Right? So we have mechanical and chemical digestion in the mouth, chemical digestion in the small intestine, and then chemical digestion of fiber from the bacteria in our large intestine. Okay. So how does our body use carbohydrates? Mainly, it's going to be as a source of energy. Okay. So carbohydrates, like proteins, provide 4 kilocalories per gram, and will be our main source of energy during activity or high-intensity exercise. And then, of course, there are cells in our body that only use carbohydrates as their energy source, or mainly will use carbohydrates as their energy source. So red blood cells can only use glucose to supply their energy. However, they do not have mitochondria, so they're not doing the full process of cellular respiration. They're doing anaerobic respiration. No, glucose is the only source of energy they will use. And then glucose is going to be especially important for our muscles and for our neurons, our brain cells. So if we take a look here, this is describing the proportion of energy that came from either carbohydrates or fat during different intensities, different types of intensities of an exercise over a 1-hour period. Okay. So during light exercise, so think about like a long walk or a relatively flat hike, okay? A majority of the energy being used during that light exercise, so 87.5% of the energy being used, is going to come from fat, okay? Our stored, much higher energy dense molecule. So since fat is much more energy dense, but does take a bit longer to fully break apart, that is going to be what our body prefers as the energy source when at rest or during low intensity exercise. And then as we increase the intensity and need energy faster, it's going to start shifting towards preferring carbohydrates, preferring glucose, because the cellular metabolism of glucose in order to convert it into usable energy is faster, even though it is somewhat less efficient because we're getting less energy per gram. So again, light exercise is almost all of our energy is going to come from fat. In moderate exercise, we get almost a 50-50 split. So this you could consider a jog, right? But even though we have almost a 50-50 split here, again, carbohydrates are much less energy dense. So if this was exactly 50-50, you would need more than double the amount of carbohydrate compared to fat in order to get that same amount of energy, right? Carbohydrates give 4 kilocalories per gram, fat give 9. And so if 50% of the energy comes from carbs and 50% of the energy comes from fat, you need double the amount of grams of carbohydrates to match the amount of energy you're getting from fat. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. But the main point here is that the more intense the exercise gets, the more that our bodies will start to shift towards carbohydrates as their main energy source for that much quicker source of energy. And so intense exercise, so now think about a sprint, right? Our muscles are going to be mainly using carbohydrates as their source of energy and just a little bit coming from our stored fat. So when we do lack enough glucose in order to provide the energy that our body needs for whatever activity it's doing, we will start to convert other molecules into glucose. So our bodies do have the ability to transform all of our different nutrients into each other. So we can transform fats into carbs and proteins. We can transform proteins into carbs and fats and vice versa, right? All of them are connected. All of them can be converted. However, our go-to is going to be converting fats or amino acids into our carbohydrate energy source, into glucose. And as a result, that will produce ketones. Or I guess, sorry, let me back up. I explained that a bit incorrectly. So when we are using fats or amino acids as our alternative energy source for fast energy, that will produce ketones as a byproduct of that process. And those ketones can then provide energy to our different molecules, right? Especially like our neurons can take up ketones, or preferentially can take up ketones from our bloodstream. However, some research is pointing towards the dangers of a high concentration of ketones traveling through our circulatory system. So the risk is that ketones are a bit acidic. And so if our circulatory system or our blood gets too acidic, things are going to start malfunctioning and not working properly. However, it seems to be that the concentration of ketones needed to substantially change the pH level of our blood is quite high, and so it is actually quite difficult to reach. So in general, as of right now, ketones as our energy source, or like a keto diet, should be generally safe. So another process that our body will convert to, or will use preferentially when we don't have enough glucose, is completely changing proteins into glucose. So this is a process called gluconeogenesis. If we break this word apart, we have gluco referring to glucose, neo meaning new, and genesis meaning the creation or birth of. And so this word literally means creating new glucose, which is what our body does. It converts proteins into glucose molecules and then sends that into the blood. So this is a process done in the liver, and will then release glucose into our circulatory system. So we do have a secondary role of carbohydrates, which is much less universally important, but that comes from fiber in our diet, acting as filler. And so food high in fiber is generally considered to be much healthier, or a very healthy option. And one of the reasons is because fiber takes up a lot of space. So that will help us feel full faster, increase that feeling of satiety, right? So you're not eating as much or overeating, and will slow down the process of digestion and absorption, so that we are taking in these foods at a slow rate, not spiking our blood glucose levels, which can be a risk with high carbohydrate density foods. And so foods high in fiber are also typically going to come with lots of our micronutrients that our body needs. So a wide variety of minerals and nutrients. And so eating a diet with lots of foods high in fiber has been linked to enhanced weight loss, again, because of that increased satiety, so less likely to overeat, and slower digestion and absorption. And has also been associated with lower risks of gastrointestinal diseases. Right. And so we've been talking mainly about glucose, right? Like why is our body converts all of our monosaccharides into glucose, and then our cells are then going to take up that glucose and use it as energy. But what is happening to fructose, since fructose is the second most common monosaccharide in our diet? So if we look at these chemical pathways here, this is showing all the different steps that it would take to take one glucose molecule after it's been absorbed and convert it into glycogen, use it as a source of energy all the way down here, or turn it into fat and store it as a longer-term energy source. And so with glucose, it only takes 1, 2, 3 different chemical reactions to convert a glucose molecule into a forming polysaccharide of glycogen, and takes many more steps in order for our body to completely convert that glucose molecule into a fatty acid. Compared to that, fructose can end up in the same results. It can be converted into glycogen. It can even be converted into glucose. It can be turned into fatty acid, and it can be used as a source of energy. However, it takes much less steps to turn fructose into a fatty acid, and many more steps to turn fructose into glycogen. And so the fructose in our foods, and which you could think of also all the simple sugars and added sugars, so high fructose corn syrup, that added simple sugar is mainly fructose. So all the foods that taste really sweet are going to be high in fructose instead of glucose. So fructose has a much quicker, much fewer steps required in order to be converted into fatty acids, and much more steps in order to be converted into stored glycogen or into glucose, which would be usable by the rest of the body. And so when we're eating a lot of these simple sugars, we run the risk of those simple sugars being turned into fat instead of being sent to the body as glucose or stored as glycogen. And so really sweet foods often are also associated with increased weight gain or increased concentration of fat tissue, right? Because this fructose can be converted into fatty acid faster than it can be converted into glycogen or glucose. Okay. And so our body has control or attempts to control the amount of glucose available in our blood because we don't want to waste that precious energy source and we want to have it stored when we have excess of it so that it's not being filtered out by our kidneys and released with our feces, or sorry, with our urine. And so we try to control the amount of glucose that is traveling through our blood so there is only the necessary amount needed for our cells to use it, and then any excess will be stored properly. And our body controls this through two different hormones called insulin and glucagon. And so these are both hormones that are produced by the pancreas. They will be released into the bloodstream and then will interact with various cells throughout our body, either to increase the absorption of glucose into those cells, so taking glucose out of the bloodstream, or to start releasing more glucose into the bloodstream, such as interacting with the liver and telling it to start breaking down that glycogen. And so insulin and glucagon are essentially opposites. Insulin is going to react to high blood sugar and help remove glucose from the bloodstream, and glucagon is going to react to low blood sugar and help add glucose to the bloodstream. Okay. So our pancreas will release insulin after we have started eating, or when there is a high amount of glucose in our blood, so when we have a high blood sugar. And this is going to stimulate the cells of our body to start absorbing more glucose from our blood and stimulate the liver to start converting glucose into glycogen. So again, this is a response to when there is a high amount of glucose traveling in our circulatory system, traveling in our bloodstream. Right? And if this isn't regulated or controlled, that glucose will eventually be filtered out through our kidneys and we will lose that nutrient with our urine. And so insulin being released as a response to high blood sugar here is going to tell our cells to open up the protein channels that allow glucose to enter the cell, and is going to tell the liver that we have enough glucose traveling in our blood, let's start storing all this excess. So the liver will start to convert glucose into glycogen at a higher rate. Okay. This is just a diagram kind of showing that. So the pancreas secretes insulin into the blood, into the circulatory system when there is a high amount of glucose traveling in our blood. That insulin will then bind with some of the receptor proteins, which will cause those receptor proteins to open channels, which will allow glucose to diffuse across the membrane. So without this channel, glucose cannot cross the plasma membrane of our cells. So insulin helps open up those protein channels, allowing glucose to then enter the cells, leaving our bloodstream. So the opposite would be glucagon. Glucagon, again, is being released by the pancreas, but instead of reacting to high blood sugar, glucagon is the signal sent out when we have low blood sugar, so a low concentration of carbohydrates or glucose in our blood. And so this is going to stimulate the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So again, it's our pancreas reacting to the fact that there is not enough glucose traveling through our blood, so our cells are not getting enough of this energy source. And so this is going to tell our liver to start releasing some of that stored glucose that it was holding as glycogen, and then that glucose can travel through the circulatory system. And this is also going to stimulate that conversion of amino acids into glucose, so gluconeogenesis. Okay. So this is mainly reacting with our liver. Our liver is going to start breaking down our stored glycogen and is going to start converting amino acids into glucose. And both will result in more glucose being available to the blood. But this is also reacting with some of our skeletal muscles, which do have glycogen stored in them. Again, the hormone is coming from the pancreas, but in this case, when there is a low amount of glucose available, that glucagon will then interact with receptor proteins on our liver, which will cause a series of chemical reactions that tell the liver to start breaking down our stored glucose, glycogen, so that we have individual glucose molecules to then release back into the bloodstream. And now we have more available energy. Okay. So We do have two different values that we use to essentially describe the quality of glucose or carbohydrate that is going to come from our food. So these are the glycemic index, which is the older measurement, and then glycemic load, which is the newer, more important representation of the amount of carbohydrate in our food. So the glycemic index was a measurement of essentially the quality of glucose in a food. So this was based on measuring how much free glucose was traveling in the bloodstream after you have eaten a specific food. And this was comparing it to a pure glucose drink. So if you mix 50 grams of sucrose into a standard 12-ounce cup of water, that is considered a pure glucose drink. And for most individuals, if you drink that full cup of water, within 20 minutes, you will have a certain amount of glucose traveling through your blood, and that became our standard 100 measurement. So a GI of 100 is how our body reacts to pure glucose. So any other food is then going to be put on this scale, and if they have a GI higher than 100, that means that is putting more glucose into our bloodstream than a pure glucose drink did. And if it is lower, then it's putting less glucose into our bloodstream than a pure glucose drink. Right? So essentially, the idea was that for a healthy diet, you should aim to be eating foods that have a low GI and thus a low impact on your blood glucose levels, or at least a slower impact on your blood glucose levels. And these foods had other associations. So not only that they don't produce dramatic fluctuations in your blood glucose levels, so high spikes and low valleys, but they were also associated with increasing high-density lipoprotein to low-density lipoprotein ratios. This is a concept we'll come back to in the next chapter. But essentially, high-density lipoproteins are good. Low-density lipoproteins are considered to be bad. They're more likely to stick to the linings of our arteries and capillaries and cause clots. Right? Whereas high-density lipoproteins are more likely to make it to their target and even pick up any of those stuck lipids throughout our circulatory system. Foods with low GIs are generally higher in fiber, which is also considered to be healthy because of all the other associations we talked about, and may reduce the risk of heart disease and colon cancer. But again, this value has since been built upon, giving us our glycemic load, which is the more newer, probably more important value to be considering. So the glycemic load not only considers the overall impact on blood glucose levels, but is also looking at the quantity of accessible carbohydrate in that food. So you can think of this as the total amount of carbohydrates available in a food minus the fiber, because that fiber, which is still a carbohydrate, is inaccessible to us, right? We don't produce the enzymes necessary to break it down. Only a small amount of fiber is going to be digested once they make it to the large intestine. And so really the only carbohydrates in our food that we're going to be accessing and converting into glucose is everything that is not fiber. Right? So that is what we mean by accessible carbohydrate. So any carbohydrate that we will actually be able to digest and use. Okay. So for instance, if we look at like the watermelon here, watermelon has a generally high GI, 76, right? So has the potential to provide a lot of glucose into our bloodstream. However, it has a very, very low glycemic load of 8 because it is a plant with a lot of fiber in that food. So even though there is a lot of carbohydrate, a lot of sugar available in there, we are going to digest and absorb that sugar slowly because of all of the fiber that will get in the way and slow down that process and take up space. So watermelon has a lot of sugar in it, but not much of that sugar is actually accessible or will be accessed slowly. Just continuing that table to give you some more examples of common foods, but that is all for this portion of our chapter on carbohydrates. So good luck, reach out with any questions, and I'll see you in the next one.